The Spinoff Podcast Network. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
The Fold is brought to you by O-Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Michael Donaldson, who I actually have some personal history with. He was the sports editor of the Sunday Star Times, which was where I did my internship as a student journalist, and I've got nothing but the fondest memories of that. It's incredibly, this was in I think 2005, and it's very intimidating walking into a newsroom when you're from. When they were just big, they're very fast paced. Everyone knows exactly what they're doing. A lot of people are don't have a lot of time for the latest wet behind the ears intern who's walked in through the door. But Michael was incredibly kind. I had the experience of reporting out stories that made its way into a publication I had read very religiously. The Sunday Star Times was at the time my favourite newspaper in the country, and still would be, that and the Weekend Herald are the ones that I would sort of really, struggle without. So it just was an incredible and very galvanising and validating experience, and so I'll be forever grateful to him for that. And so we talk about his time. He started in sports journalism in the late 80s and ran through the sort of glory days and golden age of print journalism, of newspaper journalism, and then decided in the mid-2010s, when it started to really kind of get shaken and pulled apart by the rise of digital, decided to go out on his own. And what he went out to do is, I think, really interesting. He basically started editing and then ultimately bought a publication called The Pursuit of Hoppiness, which is now both a free print publication that you can pick up at pubs, but also a Substack newsletter, which I really strongly recommend subscribing to if you're into craft beer. That's basically what he has built his post-newspaper career around, is an interest in craft beer, which, stretched back his whole adult life before it was even called craft beer. And I think what he has done with it is a really interesting and quite sort of a very well-formulated example of a kind of a niche media business, like a community-oriented media business. That has been... There's a kind of a big truism about media in recent times, where there was a scale era where everyone was just taking the gusher of traffic that came from Facebook in the sort of early mid-2010s and was trying to build these enormous kind of unicorn valued media businesses like the likes of BuzzFeed and Vice. BuzzFeed is now worth less than half of what NZME is on the NASDAQ, and Vice is, if it's not bankrupt, it's sort of hovering around there. And the big trend has been, actually, you don't want the biggest possible audience, you want one that is really meaningfully engaged and wrapped around a particular subject. And The Pursuit of Hoppiness is a version of that. It's really well executed. The newsletter keeps you current, tells you what some good beers to buy, and keeps you across the kind of news within the industry. And then the publication has a bit more of that sort of lean back quality to it. So we just sort of discussed his journey from sports journalism in the 80s to running this really, really well thought out media business within craft beer now. So I really, really enjoyed talking with Michael and kind of thinking about or hearing about the evolution of his career in the context of the evolution of the media business through that time. One quick plug, if I may. I have just, in the last couple of weeks, taken over editing Rec Room, which is our sort of pop culture newsletter. Invariably, the way I do it has crossover with the kind of material which I talk about on The Fold. So if you're a fan of this podcast, would love it if you head to the newsletter section of the Spinoff. It's very easy to navigate there and subscribe to Rec Room. And just because I think that the way I want to make it work is have Rec Room, The Fold, and my writing sort of talk to one another and have, a sort of a sense of community around that. So yeah, go and check out Rec Room on the Spinoff. And also, please subscribe and chuck a rating on this podcast if you enjoy it. That stuff really helps keep it in charts and helps the distribution through platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So that's all from me. Please enjoy Michael Donaldson, the owner and editor of the Pursuit of Hoppiness, on The Fold. Pinakwe, Michael, welcome to The Fold. Thank
you, Duncan. It's a real pleasure to be here, to be honest. Yeah.
Oh, it's cool. It's good to see you again. You were, as I said before, you were, my absolute first editor in journalism proper. So no, it's really great to catch up. I wondered if you could go back to the very start for you, and what was it about newspapers that sort of drew you in?
Sure. I will say that you were the best internal work experience person we ever had, Sunday Star Times Sport. You and Tony Street. So there you go.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, she was very good.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You're the best person I ever interned for. So
awesome. Go back to the start, crikey. So we're talking 1988, and I had just finished a phys ed degree down in Otago, and one of my classmates had been a journalist and had worked at the Waikato Times, and she went from graduating in phys ed school to getting a job then in sport at the Otago Daily Times. She's called Toni Bruce. You may have heard of her. She's a professor at Auckland University now. Writes a lot about sport and media. Well, that's her whole area. And anyway, Toni very briefly worked at the ODT and got a scholarship to go to the States, and basically turned around and said, you could do this job, you know sport, you can write, and dragged me into the Otago Daily Times and introduced me to the deputy sports editor and said, this is Michael, he's going to do my job for a while. And I don't know whether they were just overwhelmed by the bolshiness of it. It was literally a stopgap because they were about to hire a person called Richard Bock. And,
oh, wow.
Yes.
And with so much talent.
I know. And there was a period there, and this is what in my mind, it's different probably to how the reality was, but as I understood it, Toni was leaving in, let's say, August to go to the States, and Richard couldn't start till maybe the Christmas or something like that, and there was a gap to fill, and I did it in an incredibly unconvincing manner.
But clearly something stuck. Well, do you want to sort of describe your experience of it? What was the newsroom like back then? Because this is, ODT is not the biggest in the country by any means back then. But
so literally, I guess they hired me as a stringer would be the best description. I wasn't staff. I worked weekends covering a hodgepodge of sports. Rugby league, can you believe it, in Dunedin? Hockey, basketball, the sort of minor sports, I guess you'd say. And I typed up copy on, my sister-in-law had a typewriter, and I got some copy paper from the ODT, and every Sunday I would type up my stuff, and I would walk in there and hand it to the chief sports sub, who was a guy called Barry Stewart, who subsequently went on to be the editor of the ODT. And Barry was amazing. He just would go, can't say that, that's no, wrong, and would cross out my copy in front of me and rewrite it, and probably retyped it later on, or somebody did. And so as a newsroom experience, it was very, very analog, first of all. Everything was on paper and typewriters, so everything's very manual and physical. The editing process was done by hand at that stage anyway. There were conversations about what you were doing and how you were doing it. But for me, it was a total education, and it was at the end of that period that I went, okay, I'm not going to have a career in phys ed or wherever I was going. I think I was going to start a master's at that point, and I applied to do journalism school, and I applied all around the country, got in at Canterbury, and yeah, everything went from there really, and did all the hunting around for different jobs. But my first real job was at the press in Christchurch, and I think that's where I really, really, really fell in love with newspapers, because the old press building had the printing press in the basement, and so you were there you could go down and have the noise and have the papers coming off the press straight off it, and the smell and the ink and the noise and the touch, the texture of the paper, all that kind of stuff is I like the visceral nature of it. It was great. It was a really cool experience. Yeah.
What do you consider the sort of zenith of your career in print, or when did it feel like it was most kind of working, I suppose? Do you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to imagine, like your career spans sort of, late in print spans late 80s to I think about 2014, maybe 2016.
Yeah, 2014 I think I left Fairfax stuff.
So yeah. Basically from the internet was not even imagined to it was really starting to eat into the business. And I'm sort of trying to think of when the thing felt like it was at its apex for you personally.
Yeah. Okay. In an era, it would have been roughly 2007 to 2010. In that period, I was a sports editor at the Sunday Star Times, and we'd had a Lions tour in 2005, and that was, actually probably the period stretches back to there, selling 220,000 papers on a Sunday. Like it was...
That's extraordinary,
It was absolutely extraordinary. And the Lions tour was massive. And then out of that, for me, I covered that tour, and the subsequent years, probably leading up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. I mean, it was extraordinary what we did every Saturday to get out not just a sports section, but a newspaper. And
this was a broadsheet. I think
huge,
people, you can't sort of, now that everything apart from the Weekend Herald is largely compact, just the volume of stories, like the Sunday Star Times sports section would probably have as many stories in it as, it's half a newspaper now. Like there was just so much content.
I can remember that in those days, the sports section itself was 24 broadsheet pages. If we went down to 22, we were grumbling like, well, there's not enough space. And
so that's 48 pages of a compact, which would be,
That's about the size of the Wednesday Herald.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was phenomenal. And you've got to remember at the same time, the Sunday News was churning out chunky, probably 60-page tabloid. Yeah, the Herald on Sunday as well. I think Truth was still happening. And a lot of that was happening out of that one building up the road in Eden Terrace. Sunday Star Times, Sunday News, Truth, Turf Digest, Friday Flash, they were all in that building.
It's not a big building, but there's a lot coming out.
Yeah. But the sheer volume of content, like we would have 3 pages of racing alone, which was phenomenal. And I mean, some weeks it was like you didn't know how you were going to fill it. But there were 2 pages of just results. We had every sports result from around the world. It was a huge team of people.
How many people were just in sports?
Yeah, so have to count them on my. Yeah,
that's all right.
Maybe there were 5 or 6 full-timers and then maybe up to 3 casuals on a Saturday. It was maybe 10 people working on a Saturday plus stringers. And it was quite a lot to manage, the copy flow coming in and that production. And I think deadline was, I'm trying to remember, maybe 10 o'clock for first edition. So every rugby game was finishing kind of right on deadline, and it was so exciting. Everything was really exciting and vibrant, and we were meaningful, I think, in that time. People still cared about what was in their Sunday paper. You know, you would drive around on Sunday listening to, ZB and what was the guy's name? Murray Deaker.
And the voice of God.
Yeah. But he would analyse the sports sections in the Sunday paper and tell you who'd done the best ones, and who had the good stories. And it was phenomenal how much interest there was in it, and how ridiculously important we felt to an extent, and not important like ego, but to get it right.
It was mission, right?
Yeah,
it felt like this crucial part of society was documenting it in real time.
Yeah, and at the end of that era was when the first kind of digital creep sort of started to come in, and none of us really understood it. Even though we all used the internet, we couldn't comprehend why anyone would want, circa 2010 now, why anyone would want to go and read this stuff on a computer, because it was so tactile, and it was all about, opening up and discovering stuff as you went through the paper. And it's just such a different experience. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I think that sense of sort of trust and the editorial decision making, the hierarchy, of the way that stories were presented, and the audience sort of subliminally says, well, understands like if it's on the front page, it really matters.
Yes.
Whereas now the way that it's sorted is and served is very different. So when it starts to chip away, how does that manifest within the newsrooms?
Well, my memory of it, and I'm going back away now, is there was just no idea of how to navigate to the place we are now. I always remember Paul Thompson, who was towards the end of my career there, was editor-in-chief or chief executive or just the boss of Fairfax /stuff. And when he moved to Radio New Zealand, giving that example of the, standing on the burning platform of an oil rig in the North Atlantic, and if you jump, you're doomed. If you stay, you're doomed. And that was the real sense at the time of, we've got this newspaper. It's still a good newspaper, even though it had slowly been gutted. Advertising had fallen away. The people in power at Stuff are not the same ones now, so there's not a critique of them, but the Fairfax at the time, and they didn't know what to do with the Sunday paper. I think they knew that it had to change. They knew that they had to go digital. There was just a whole lot of, we know we have to do stuff, but we don't know what it is we have to do. And that's that whole, known unknown kind of thing. It's like, well, what's the mechanism by which you get from here to here? And that was Paul's analogy of the, it's the devil in the deep blue sea. Any dilemma like that. And to Sinead Boucher's absolute credit and the team around her, when she took charge, it was like, no, we're going here. And I think at the time, looking back, that was all anyone wanted, was a vision, leadership,
pick one.
Decision. Yeah, exactly. And it's very hard when you're, if you like, the troops on the ground. And we went through a period there in that Auckland newsroom. It was the Sunday Star Times, and it was a massive newsroom, and there was some great people working there. And slowly it became the Auckland Bureau of Stuff.
And some of what they did was put out a paper on a Sunday.
Yes. It was the it was a thing that you did at the end of the week. As a newsroom, there were certain people still focused on the newspaper, and I was one of them. But that team shrank and shrank and shrank. And you had this fight for resource and fight for relevance.
Yeah.
Like, which is more important, us or them?
And that's kind of what, it is a bit of like demand side, supply side, like was it the audience energy slow drift to digital and from there to mass fragmentation, or was it the sort of the steady drip of a reduction in resource? But obviously some part of, and it's obviously both, but somewhere along that line it must have lost a bit of its romance and kind of and mission for you ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, I can think of certain things, and one of them's really bizarre.
And that?
Yeah, around 2010, 11 maybe, someone came up with this idea of putting QR codes in stories in print that would take you to a digital experience off the print, and whether it was to a video or and we used to put lots of audio into online stories back in the day, sort of podcasts before there were podcasts. But anyway, this whole idea of QR codes. And so this was this attempt to say, hey, we know people want this digital experience. We don't quite know how to give it to them, but we'll take them there from an analog place to a digital place. And in some ways, the thinking was quite ahead of its time, because I use QR codes now in the print publication that I've got as a way of taking people to something that they can't get from print, i.e. a link to buy tickets to an event, for signing up to an email newsletter out of the print thing. So it's I don't know, you might use the word sanitary kind of product. It's the thing, it's a useful stepping stone.
Yeah, it just sort of accelerates or reduces some barriers to entry.
Yeah, yeah. And this is 10 years later.
Yeah.
So it's like the idea was good, and but I can remember at the time as a print person thinking, what are we doing this for?
Because it's all very resource intensive, right?
Yeah.
And you're taking it from a medium where there is a very good kind of financial basis, the relationship between advertising and the content that wraps around it, to a place where that is far less clear and spending a lot of money and resource on it.
Yeah.
It is the sort of paths not taken back then must kind of sit prominent in the memory for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think back to an All Blacks tour I did, 2006 to Europe ahead of the 2007 World Cup. And audio was the thing. We had to tape everything we could, edit it, like I had editing software there for putting these
2006.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And sending it back in, and it was getting put up on a website somewhere. But I have no idea, no one would have known what the traffic to that website was, and who clicked on the audio and what use it was. But it was just so difficult and so annoying as a print person. You type in all your words and, oh my God, now I have to edit this audio down to make it usable. But again, it was a valiant attempt to go into that space and think about added value, for want of another word. And it wasn't, again, they didn't have the vision for the final place. They just knew that people were starting to play in this space and we have to give them something they can use but no one ever leveraged it, didn't go anywhere.
I mean, the numbers would probably have been tiny, but again, I think that it's easy to, with hindsight, kind of say that was a misplaced use of resource, but even the skill of having live analytics and testing and learning and abandoning strategies is natural to and has grown out of technology, but it's not something that's natural to newspaper people.
No. I mean, your testing, if you like, your A/B testing is you couldn't have it in print. People either liked it or they didn't. You couldn't give them another version
You might
the
have
next day.
like a the first edition or an afternoon edition.
True.
You get a signal over time with this front page sold and this didn't.
Yeah.
Trying to figure
Yeah.
out how, but it was very much a blunt instrument in some respects.
Yeah.
At what point? So talk about your leaving and why you left. To what extent it was a push or a pull of this idea of the pursuit of hoppiness.
Well, when I think about so I ended up probably not foolishly, because it was a really good experience, but I agreed to be the deputy editor at the Sunday Star Times, sort of 2011-ish, maybe, late 2010, 2011, did that for about 4 years. And this was at the time of premium resource reduction. And it was really hard. Like, it was really, really hard we had such a small team. It was quite hard to, I don't know, drive through that us and them thing between digital and print. The newsroom was quite fractured. And there were good people driving different things. And it was a difficult period. That's all I can say, really. We had some interesting management characters. Mitchell Murphy was a guy who came in from Australia. He was, I don't know if you ever met him, but he was this incredibly larger-than-life Australian. And he was a disruptor, that's for sure. And he was the person who started what was briefly Auckland Now, and based off something that had happened with Fairfax in Australia. And I just think there was a period there where, right, we're going to go here into the digital space, but we're going to do it with what we've got here, and that means, as we've said, less resource for the print side of it. And then there was a constant, why isn't the print side of it any good? Why aren't you selling more papers? That front page doesn't work. Can't believe you did that. It's
just slowly wears on you.
Yeah, and in the end, for me, I didn't fall out of love with newspapers. I fell out of love with working on Saturdays, and then getting kind of beaten up on Tuesdays, and partly my own fault. I wasn't necessarily geared to be a newsroom leader. I don't think that was my thing. And not that I ever was. I was always deputies, and I don't know what deputies really sometimes, whether it's in politics or newsrooms. It just felt like you're always going around trying to make people work together a little bit better and relate news from the top down and relate news from the bottom up or whatever. It was, I enjoyed the role, but I didn't enjoy that environment anymore. And I especially just didn't want to give my Saturday nights to it after, it had been 10 years by the time I left, basically, of Saturday nights. And it gets quite grinding. You don't have that social life that other people have. You always say no to doing things. And, there's only so long, I think. There is a lifespan, and there's a little bit of a joke. It's not a joke because it's serious, but the number of people who work in sport who have had heart attacks in my time of working in this media environment, they're invariably subs. And I think it's just a stressful life. You work late, you don't eat well, you probably occasionally drink too much late at night, therefore don't sleep well. Yeah, old school media was a bad environment.
Yeah, notoriously so.
Yeah.
Working on an important object. The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis. So let's switch tack. Do you recall your first craft beer?
Yes and no. As in, I recall, if I want to really puff myself up, it was like drinking Max Black and Max Gold back in the early to mid 80s. And thinking that this was different. You know, I'd been reared on Lion Red, and DB Draft, and then in Dunedin Spates. And when I had Max for the first time, it was like, okay, this is different. But we didn't even have a word for craft beer then.
Different.
It was just different.
And that wasn't long after the founding of Max, is that right?
No, so it was 81 that it started. And this was definitely, I can remember drinking it in sort of 84, 85. And it's definitely sort of the 87, 88 when I was living in Christchurch. And also drinking Harrington's beer sometime in that period. I can recall my brother who lived in Christchurch, and I think I moved up there to take my job at the press, and I think you could go to Harrington's and get, you know, rigger fills, and it was just, it's quite cheap and it's pretty boozy, you know. And so again, but we didn't have a word for it as craft beer. So that's one aspect of it. And then when I lived in Australia, there was stuff like Cooper's Sparkling Ale, Little Creatures Pale Ale. And again, every time, you know, I was always looking for something new and something different. I can even remember being at the Atlanta Olympics, and in the media room, Beck's was the beer of choice, but I didn't pick the lager. They had a Beck's Dark, and that was my choice, you know, whether it was thinking back to the Black Max or whatever. But, you know, I was always interested in a new beer taste, a different beer taste, discovering stuff. And it was only when I moved back to New Zealand, sort of around 2005, and the experience that blew me away was Emerson's Pilsner. And I can, you know, I still remember the moment. It was the Martinborough Hotel. It was Christmas Eve. I'm going to say 2006. It might have been 2007. And getting pints of Emerson's Pilsner and just literally going to my wife like, just wow, just taste this, taste it. It's amazing. And she thought it was so good, she put away the Chardonnay and sort of started having a beer as well. And so that was the moment. That was the, okay, there is something going on here that is completely different to anything I've experienced. Even the Little Creatures Pale Ale, which back in 2003 or 4 blew me away to the same extent, but I didn't kind of have a word to describe it back then. You know, it was just, it's a beer you get in Fremantle or Perth when you're over there. It wasn't, it wasn't craft. Like, even then it wasn't craft, it was a micro.
Yeah, right.
You know, so yeah, that was the moment.
So, and it's interesting, right, because the rise of craft beer in New Zealand almost perfectly matches the decline of print. And what prompted you to think, actually, there is a business here, there is a gap here that I feel well qualified to fill?
I think I identified a gap before I identified a business. And that was, again, Sunday Star Times, maybe late 2010. And when I said Mitchell Murphy was the editor at one point, but he then moved to become publisher or editor-in-chief, and a guy called David Kemmies came in as the editor. And David was, he's a very sophisticated, intelligent man. He knew art, he knew wine, but he was blue-collar in his ethos. And he was a big rugby league fan, good friend of the Mad Butcher. And I just had a sense from him that there was some possibilities. So I just said, why don't we get rid of this wine column that we have in the Escape section, which was the little magazine-y travel type thing, and there was a wine column there, and give me a beer column. And he just said, good idea. And it was like, really? You sure? And I can still remember the first column I wrote, and my God, I had no idea what I was writing about. I just knew that I wanted to explore this area, and I'd kind of discovered Epic Pale Ale at that point, and I was drinking some Croucher Pilsner, I think, both by those standards very hoppy. And so I started writing about beer, and I learned as I went along. And that Star Times column kind of put me in a space that no one else was really in. There were people writing about beer. There was Jeff Griggs doing it mainly for the Marlborough Express. He was based in Blenheim, and Jeff's like the kind of godfather of beer writing in New Zealand to an extent. He knew Michael Jackson, the beer writer, not Michael Jackson, the singer, from his BBC days. So Jeff was a bit of a guru, but he didn't have the Marlborough Express didn't have the audience that the Sunday Star Times did. There was a guy, Neil Miller, who died last year, I think, unfortunately. And Neil was writing and blogging at a time when there weren't really blogs as such. And there were a handful of other people doing it, but I was blessed to have this nationwide platform and, and lucky enough to have someone say, yeah, go off and do that. And out of that came the book, the first book I did called Beer Nation. And it was only when the book came along that it was like, okay, this is something I could do. And the book, sort of helps establish you, gives you credibility. It's like, oh, that guy wrote a book, he must know what he's talking about. And even back then, like even now I say, I don't know. I'm still learning stuff, 10, 12 years on. But back then I was literally learning as I went, and making mistakes and getting things back the front, which I did a couple of times, because there's so much arcane knowledge in
That's
beer.
right. It's this brand new sort of space that is kind of being willed into existence. The thing that sort of hits me, because I my grounding is as a music writer and critic, and it always strikes me that in some respects that sort of like indie music has been replaced by craft beer, or certainly it felt that way for a period of time, and that it has lots of these like labels and the particular beers are like bands, and they're sort of followed in a similar cult-like way by a similar kind of personality type. But there was a sort of a history and an infrastructure there. This was being built out from scratch. And it's quite different to sports in a lot of ways. Like it's a lot more organic in terms of these new things popping up and rising and falling. You need a wholly different language. How did you find that sort of transition as a writer?
It's interesting to think back again to how little I knew. And I think about sport, and you come into sport, and to an extent music, it's filled your entire life up until that point. Like I was mad about sport from the age of 5. I just couldn't get enough of it. I was up watching All Blacks in the middle of the night with my father. When we briefly lived in the States when I was like 6 or 7, and I was hugely into baseball. I just loved baseball. And I had all the heroes, and music's the same. Music comes at you maybe a little bit later, but it's with you through your adolescence, just as sport is. Alcohol and beer, they come to you later in life, and so you're discovering them as a kind of wide-awake adult. And so it's you have to go back and find all this stuff that in other areas it's been imbued in you already.
That's right.
So you can... like I think any good New Zealand, or any ordinary New Zealander could write you a few hundred words about an All Blacks test. They might not be perfectly grammatically correct. The structure could change, but they could tell you what happened and do the old blow by blow like we used to do back in the old days of sport where no one analysed anything. They just told you what happened. And someone could probably do that with music, explain why they like it, and tell you a history of a band or something like that. But yeah, so beer was, this is something, that's immediately in craft beer, 40 years old maybe. In sort of modern terms, at least 150 years old, dating back to refrigeration and pasteurization and yeast. And then 500 years old when you go back to the first lager has been made in Germany, and then you discover it's actually 10,000 years old, and that there's all these incredible geographic, like rivulets that come to form this ocean that we have now of beer. And so, in some ways it's a bit like music and sport, like there's different genres, there's different sports, different countries do things in different ways. Different countries have different sports and different musical traditions, and so the same with beer to an extent. There are lots and lots of traditions, and we have some in New Zealand, but not a lot. But we do have our own unique, beerosphere, if you like.
Yeah, it feels that way, certainly, and I think you chronicle it very well. So just tell me about kicking it off and why print and how the, how it's sort of worked for you.
Okay, so so when I left Fairfax to freelance, I was mostly freelancing in journalism areas, and I did a couple more books, sort of the biography that I did with Steve Williams, the caddy, and then sort of I was arm twisted into writing a Lydia Ko biography.
Was this with participation or without?
No.
Yeah.
And they precisely wanted to do an unauthorized biography.
I had to do a donut profile of her for Metro, so I can sympathise, but certainly not to the extent that you must have.
Yeah. It was literally a first draft of history. I mean, I enjoyed doing it, but it was by no means something that I would sit down and say I was incredibly proud of writing an unauthorized biography.
The life of a freelancer is gigs.
Yeah, and it's money,
Yeah.
So initially I wasn't making money writing about beer, but in about 2015, I'd been freelancing about a year, and so the background to the Pursuit of Hoppiness magazine and website now is that it started as a newsletter for an organisation called SOBER, Society of Beer Advocates, and it was a great little local newsletter in Wellington, and it slowly gained some national traction, distributed free in bars and bottle stores. And in 2015, Sober came to me and said, would you like to edit this magazine? And it was like, absolutely, I'll jump all over it. And it was an amateur publication, and I mean amateur, totally volunteer driven. As an editor, I got some money. It wasn't a lot, but I immediately had this vision for it that it could be so much more than it was. And I took it through one redesign process and sort of took it a little bit more upmarket and colourful and bright. And that was probably not the wisest thing to do because it costs money to do bespoke designs. But, Sober believed in it. They believed in me. But it was still literally a one-man operation, kind of answering to a committee. And it worked. But it always just broke even. And there was a period where, Sober decided, and this is maybe 4 years ago, that they were probably subsidising it a little bit too much. Like it was costing them a few $1,000s a year, like to pay me to underwrite some of the freight and distribution and the design costs. It didn't quite wash its face in the parlance. And we tried to get more advertising, but we didn't really have anyone to sell advertising. There was one person who did it, and she was great, but it needed someone to really just grab it and drive it from a business side of things.
It's a classic small publication kind of dilemma, really.
Yeah, and it couldn't keep surviving on a voluntary basis. And there was a part of me that didn't want to keep relying on voluntary contributions either. I wanted to pay people. And I thought journalists who wrote for it should be paid. And
it's novel.
Yeah, exactly. And so after, discussions to and fro, and what are we going to do about it? And it was literally Sober sort of came to the realization that for it to maybe realize its potential, it had to be freed from its current model. And also I think back then, to the credit of the people who were on the committee, they saw that themselves as an organisation had a limited lifespan. They were there to advocate for good beer. Good beer was kind of everywhere.
The job was done a bit.
Yeah, to an extent. And this year, Sober formally decided to fold. So there was a long-term vision that, hey, we have this really good product. We need to make sure it lasts longer than our organisation. We need to give it independence. So the people who were in charge at that time, they had the vision. And so it was sold to me for a pint of beer at Galbraith's. And we signed all the documentation. And so maybe 2019, I'm thinking, I took ownership of it. And that was when it became a business. Like, I had to build a website for it. I had to find more advertising. I was paying people. I found, a new designer for it. We templated it to an extent. Basically, I just stripped it right back to what's the bare minimum we can do to get this out right now, but without losing any of its verve or colour or importance, etc. And I think the thing that made it work was literally me going out to breweries and saying, hey, look, I've taken over the ownership of this magazine. It needs more advertising. Will you come on board? And, so heaps of people came out of there were some really good existing advertisers and sponsors, who have been there since I was editing it, like Batch Brewing, Sunshine. I'll forget people if I try to rattle them all.
Right.
But there was a handful of brew shop, home brew supplies. But I went out to the people who weren't there: Garage Project, Parrot Dog, Emerson's, a whole bunch of other people that I sort of targeted as breweries that looked like they could afford it. For one of it,
sales.
Yeah, and so it was almost not do me a favor, but it's like, hey, this is a really good publication. And
it clearly, I mean, that's always the sort of, there's a tragedy of the commons sometimes happens with publications where there is an ecosystem of to use a word that people don't like, that sort of everyone benefits from the existence of the thing, but if they don't support it, it caves in on itself, and then it sort of loses that centralizing force. And you've seen that in so many sectors over the years. But it's craft beer. It does feel like it's a big community even still. It's also incumbent on you to be a critic as well as a champion for a publication with integrity, and communities, particularly those that are as close knit, can be kind of easily wounded. How has sort of that aspect of it gone? That sort of natural tension that exists, particularly with a publication like this.
Yeah, that's it is a really good point. I guess you could put it this way: there's more than enough positive news to fill a magazine but it doesn't mean you avoid stuff that's negative to an extent. But one thing that we did, that I made a decision to do maybe a couple of years ago, was to stop reviewing beer per se, because we could only review, I think maybe 8, 12, 16, in terms of little potted reviews. And it's like, man, when there's 1,000 or more beers made a year, when, Garage Project alone makes 70, we couldn't review all the beers from one brewery, let alone all the beers made in New Zealand. And by default, we were erring towards just reviewing what was really good. And hey, this is better than your average example of this style of beer. We think you should try it. And someone did kind of call us out on that. And so why is everything so relentlessly positive? And it's like, well, there's only limited space. It only comes out 6 times a year. We only do this many reviews. Why would we pick out just one person to say their beer is horrible? And
there's a natural tension, right? Like, are you a consumer reports kind of thing? Like, here's a guide to buying good beer.
Yeah.
Or are you a critic that is trying to sort of survey the field and tell you what's good and bad about it? And, I think you just have to pick a lane there, really.
Yeah. And the lane I've picked for now, and it doesn't mean it'll always be this way, is let's celebrate what's actually really good. Let's look at trends And especially, I think the underlying thing that I always want to do, and I think it applies in any form of journalism, is bring people into it. Like the most recent edition, there's a profile of a small brewery in Glenorchy. There's, I'm trying to think, workshop in Raglan. Like talking to those people who are doing this kind of work that might not get recognition normally. And it's like, there are stories here. There are some really cool stories happening all over the place. It's not all about, the latest release from a garage project or a parrot dog or whatever. But then when stuff happens, like Epic goes into liquidation, well, you have to be all over that at the same time. But again, it's about trying to identify, in anything you do in journalism, what are people interested in? What do they want to read about? What's going to inform them, entertain them, just make them a bit happier, and beer is just a mechanism for telling more stories. It's also a great mechanism for having opinions. So it's it's different to a music magazine where you might pan an album from somebody, especially on a global scale. You could say what you like about Britney Spears or whatever, and she's never going to read it. Whereas this is a really well-read magazine in a small community, so
you have to be kind of more aware of what your contribution to that community is. And
also this is a big chunk of my livelihood now, and I think when you're an owner, publisher, editor, writer, advertising sales rep, I don't think you can afford not to try and make it. No, it naturally becomes in your image, I think. And to an extent, I am quite upbeat and positive, and I don't like dwelling on negative stuff too much. And I don't like, one thing I hated about general news journalism was that whole having to do, I guess, the negative stories, the prying into people's lives, all that kind of stuff. And sport was good for me. Sport was always invariably upbeat and positive. It's except when you covered the Black Caps in the 90s. That was a terrible period. When it's my life as much as anything, and so it's, I don't know, I hope it's a reflection of kind of who I am and what I think and almost what I believe in. And I believe in the beer industry and I believe in the people in it, and I think it's really cool. And so the default is towards sort of celebration without avoiding the sticky stuff when it comes up.
Yeah. Well, I think it achieves all that incredibly well. And anyone who's listening who likes craft beer, you could, strongly recommend subscribing to, at the very least, the Substack, and if you like that, go the full hog and get the print publication.
If you subscribe to the Substack, you get the magazine home delivered. It's a pretty good deal.
I think it's a crazy deal, to be honest, especially because it's very easy to spend $50 a year on bad craft beer, which you've got a very good chance of avoiding if you're reading this. Hey, thanks so much for coming up, Michael. I've really enjoyed reconnecting and kind of talking through the evolution of your career. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Duncan. It's been a real pleasure. I can't believe that time's just flown. That's what talking about beer does. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spinoff Podcast Network.